Hello.
Hey, hey,
How you doing today, man?
I'm doing great.
Cool, cool. Okay, so we are going to be trying something new on this show today. When we started this, one of the things that we talked about before we ever did our first episode was we had kind of like a list of things we wanted to try out, and one of them was covering real world political content. And we really haven't done like basically any of that yet, but we're going to be trying to do that today. And so what we've got is um, the first ever televised United States presidential debate, which happened in 1960. It was Kennedy versus Nixon, and I don't know. This has like a lot of lore behind it. What I've heard I've never actually watched this debate before, but what I've heard about it was that it was received very differently by television viewers than how it was received by radio listeners. Like what I was told was that television viewers perceived Kennedy to be the winner, and radio listeners perceived Nixon to be the winner. And the explanation that I've heard proposed for this was that Kennedy was very telegenic, and people just gave him extra credit for being good looking or something like that, which is sadly plausible. But yet, I think
Yeah,
it's noteworthy that also the television audience isn't going to be the same as the radio audience, and I would guess the radio audience is probably older people and more likely to be conservative, so who knows.
yeah. I know that Kennedy is one of the first presidents that, at least mentioned historically, is like really utilized the benefits of television and being able to speak face to face directly with Americans. The way I always heard it or had it taught to me in history class was very much sort of as an analogy to like FDR's fireside chats, sort of the next generation's version of that, where Kennedy really utilized that to his advantage compared to other politicians.
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully if this goes well, we might be able to do more of these in the future, and we're still like a year or two away from any like current presidential debates that are going to happen, but who knows, we'll see. um So Flowtrace, I sent you the link. So
Yep, I've got it right here. I've got it here.
yep.
See if I can stream this. There we go.
Cool.
And then let me.
Myopic Times asks what's Flowtrace's nationality. I think, are you American? Is that right?
Yes, sir. I'm from the
The people of the United States individually could not have developed the Tennessee Valley. Collectively, they could have. A cotton farmer in Georgia, or a peanut farmer, or a dairy farmer in Wisconsin or Minnesota, he cannot protect himself against the forces of supply and demand in the marketplace, but working together in effective governmental programs, he can do so. 17 million Americans who live over 65 on an average Social Security check of about $78 a month. They're not able to sustain themselves individually, but they can sustain themselves through the Social Security system. I don't believe in big government, but I believe in effective governmental action. And I think that's the only way that the United States is going to maintain its freedom. It's the only way that we're going to move ahead. I think we can do a better job. I think we're going to have to do a better job if we are going to meet the responsibilities which time and events have placed upon us. We cannot turn the job over to anyone else. If the United States fails, then the whole cause of freedom fails. And I think it depends in great measure on what we do here in this country. The reason Franklin Roosevelt was a good neighbor in Latin America was because he was a good neighbor in the United States. Because they felt that the American society was moving again. I want us to recapture that image. I want people in Latin America and Africa and Asia to start to look to America, to see how we're doing things, to wonder what the President of the United States is doing, and not to look at Khrushchev or look at the Chinese communists. That is the obligation upon our generation. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt said in his inaugural that this generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. I think our generation of Americans has the same rendezvous. The question now is, can freedom be maintained under the most severe attack it has ever known? I think it can be. And I think in the final analysis, it depends upon what we do here. I think it's time America started moving again.
All right.
And now the opening.
What's your reaction to his opening statement?
I thought that was really well done, just from a rhetorical standpoint. I think starting with the framing sort of against the Soviets and talking about how we need to succeed, we need to project strength and how our domestic issues affect, I think it's a decently good argument, and I think it's a really good effective framing device, especially, I mean, at the time in 1960s. I think that was really, really good. There were a couple specific things I thought was really good as well. There's a part in the middle where he goes, I am not satisfied over and over. He goes, I'm not satisfied with, and then some stat about like American domestic life that he isn't good, that he doesn't like. That was really effective, I thought. I thought that was really good at nailing down, like, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. Especially because 1960 election, we're coming off of Eisenhower's administration. So the Republicans, Nixon isn't the incumbent, but his party is currently in control. And I believe at this time, Nixon is actually the vice president. I believe at the time of this debate occurring, Richard Nixon is the actual vice president of the United States of America, which is something that's easy to forget, which really, I think, adds another dimension to these attacks. When JFK is saying, I'm not satisfied with all of these stats, this is all happening on the watch of the Eisenhower administration, I believe, who Richard Nixon is the vice president of. So I thought that was really, really effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I just double checked. He was the vice president at the time, and Kennedy was a senator. I agree. It was mostly pretty rhetorically effective. So I got a few different comments about that. So one is I wonder if the focus on the Cold War Soviet Union stuff has anything to do with him trying to preclude his opponent from associating him with communism, because I know there was a history of like the Democratic Party being like accused of association with communism.
Yeah, I think it's a really good move by JFK to frame all of these issues, not just as like, necessarily heart-bleeding liberal issues, but like, hey, we want America to be strong against communism. Hey, part of being strong is like making sure that families that rely on like Social Security are getting the things that they need. I thought that was really effective at sort of disarming some of the normal, or not disarming, but rather retooling a lot of more left-wing arguments in such a light that makes them far more, I think, sympathetic to more like conservative, traditionally conservative right-wing views. When you're saying like, oh, we need social security and we need, these things to be back on because it is the vitality of America that from which it projects its strength against communism and stuff like that. I thought that was really effective.
Yeah, he's trying to sell left-wing policies using right-wing values, which is something that you haven't mostly seen since then, right? I mean, I think maybe you could say like Bill Clinton did similar things sometimes, but
Yeah, I think the wave of a third way sort of neoliberalism of like the late 90s, early 2000s, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair definitely taps into that kind of energy. As does, I think, and I think that like, Obama and then Biden after him are very much also sort of in the sort of descendants of this genealogy of argument of like a much more almost like working class kind of blue collar appeal to more democratic policies, as opposed to like the very progressive left wing Bernie Sanders types sections of the party.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing that kind of struck me about this was outside of the Cold War stuff, I feel like most of this same speech would work today because you've mostly got the Democratic Party trying to do a lot of the same policies, or not like in not the specifics of it, but they're generally aligned with a lot of the same stuff that he was arguing for here.
hmm I thought it was really. I was just reminded of. I'm sure you've heard the argument before of, I used to be a left wing person, but I didn't change. The left changed.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was funny listening to this 1960 debate where JFK is talking about disparate racial outcomes in the education system. I could just imagine a Jordan B. Peterson video talking about the Marxist, cultural Marxist pursuing equality of outcomes.
Yeah, I guess like if I let me think, how do I put this? I think at least you could say like the mainstream of the Democratic Party really hasn't changed all that much
hmm
since this time. Like if you want to argue that there's been a growth of the more extreme elements or whatever, like perhaps that's true.
But
And
also a death. I mean, in the 1960s, the Dixiecrats are still going big and strong at this point. I'm 90% sure because
yeah, you're
it's
right.
the Dixiecrats. I want to say it's like in the 70s when there are a couple presidential elections that they start voting for their own party because the Democratic Party just said to hell with you guys. We're pursuing desegregation and stuff like this, and the Dixiecrats broke ranks. And then it's part of the Southern strategy. Yeah, yeah, it has to be because then it's part of Nixon's election in the Southern strategy, where then the Dixiecrats, who are now looking for a home, get sort of brought into the fold.
Yeah. So when Nixon's going to go on to lose this election, but then he runs again in 1968 and wins, and then runs for re-election in 1972 and wins, and that's
hmm
when he uses the Southern strategy that you're talking about. And yeah, this is when the South goes pretty much all Republican. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it's Barry Goldwater is 74 when LBJ seeks election after he carries out the rest of JFK's presidency, and then when he seeks his own term. I think that's Barry Goldwater.
Yeah, it's 64, but every what the rest of what
hmm
you said is right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then another thing that I was kind of struck by, like, you're pointing out all the things where he's saying, like, I'm not satisfied with this, I'm not satisfied with that. And I was struck by, like, how kind of negative it is, just because, sorry, I'm laughing at some of the chat. My Epic Times is going, dude, WTF spoilers. But, um,
That's a good one.
yeah, but anyway, the thing where Kennedy keeps going like, I'm not satisfied with this, I'm not satisfied with this. It seems like that's kind of a sharp contrast with somebody like Obama, for example, who tried to keep it to like a much more uplifting message. Now, Obama, I think, would still be arguing for a lot of the same policy prescriptions, and he would even be pointing out a lot of the same problems. But I don't think he would give a speech with that same kind of like tone of negativity throughout a lot of it.
hmm Yeah, I think part of that is the fact that I think, when we look at it, 'cause it's actually really interesting. Obama and Kennedy are in very similar situations where, we are coming to the back end of a two-term Republican president. Um, and whereas Obama is going against geez, I just said Richard Nixon, whereas Obama is going
McCain.
against John McCain, who is very much, the maverick of the Republican Party. The reason why he won the 2008 primary is because he was like a rhino, basically, right? He was, or he is the kind of person that people would call a rhino. He was very much distinct from the mainline party, and the mainline Republican Party in 2007, 2008 was not doing too hot. It was really, really beaten up badly in terms of whether or not people liked it. Whereas Nixon is the vice president of the current administration. So I think it's really interesting to see the difference in approach where both of these Democratic presidential candidates are running against a Republican, but one of them is running against a Republican who is equally rejecting the current status quo with McCain, and one of them is running against a representation of that status quo, with Richard Nixon being the current vice president. And I wonder how much that plays into it. Because if Obama is just, sort of promoting this doom and gloom, I mean, that isn't particularly motivating uniquely, I think, for him when when John McCain is also talking about, hey, we need big change, we need to shake things up. Whereas, with Kennedy, he can much more leverage the fact that, hey, if things are bad right now, that like means that you really should not be voting for the guy who is currently the vice president to become the president.
Yeah. Another thing that you just reminded me of, when you were talking about the comparison with Obama. This is just like a tangent off of that. Obama was the first black major party nominee and the first black president, and it was a very big deal, obviously. Kennedy
First
at the time
Catholic.
was the first Catholic president,
Yeah,
and
which was
at
a
the time
huge deal.
that was considered like a lot of people had a problem with it. It was a little bit controversial, and at the time it was considered a big deal.
Oh yeah, I think people really underestimate how recently in history Catholics were very much looked down upon in this country, especially in certain parts of the country,
Hmm.
where especially I think in up in like the Northeast and especially in like New England, Catholics were very much looked down upon.
And that's where he's from. He's from
Yep.
Boston. Yeah. So he it was, I guess in that region, like the Irish Catholics were considered like the lower class people or whatever. And then obviously
Hmm.
like there's more like fundamentalist Protestant parts of the country too that might have looked down on a lot of Catholics. But I think since then we've had only one more Catholic president, I think, and that's Joe Biden.
Yeah. Uh, what's the thing that actually this kind of reminds me of is a little bit about it reminds me very slightly of Donald Trump and sort of the more populist bent of talking, a more populist bent or method of or
Oh, dude,
a more populist way.
your audio is
Oh,
cutting out
hello.
pretty bad. I don't know what it is.
Sorry, hold on. Give me just a second here.
I can hear something when you talk, but it's like it's I don't even know how to describe it. It's like staticky something or other.
All right, how do I sound now?
Uh, ooh. I mean, I can hear you, but it's not like words. It's like static when you speak. I've had that happen with me like a couple times before, where I like would unplug my mic and then plug it back in, and that fixed it. And like I don't know if that'll work for you, but
Testing 1, 2, 3.
oh man, uh, it's like almost like a record scratching noise when you speak. It's really strange. I'm gonna suggest. Oh, okay, yeah, Flowtrace is gonna restart his PC. So, yeah, sorry about that. Um, so Myopic says, I don't think JFK's speech had a negative tone. He's focusing on the potential of the United States to be the best and pointing toward the current policies that inhibit the United States from doing so. Uh, I the reason I characterize that as a negative tone, like, so I think the description you gave of his speech is accurate, but the reason I characterize that as a negative tone is that the amount of time he spent pointing out all the problems that he sees in the United States at that time. I think he really did focus pretty heavily on like, I'm not satisfied with this, I'm not satisfied with this, I'm not satisfied with this, and that plus all the I'm going to use the word fear mongering about the Cold War. Now, um I understand the word fear mongering might be like implying some things that I don't necessarily mean to imply, but it's the best word that comes to mind, right? So he was talking about like there's all this big scary stuff going on around the world. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm unsatisfied with at home, and even if he's trying to get us to do better, he still spends a lot of time, talking about all the problems that are going on, both domestically and abroad. So that's why I characterized it as a negative tone. Hey, Flowtrace,
How do I
welcome back.
sound now?
Oh, perfect. You're back
Okay,
to
beautiful. I think
sounding
I know
like
what
a
the problem
human
was.
and not a DJ scratching a record or whatever it was.
No. Yeah, let me just pull this back up. But yeah, anyways, the thing I was going to mention is that it kind of reminds me of the more populist bent of talking about America in such a way that, you can be very negative about the country, very similar to how Donald Trump was, while still, and I'm not quite sure how this is, but the way that like a populist talks about, oh, our America has been destroyed, all the jobs have left, free trade has been a disaster. It just doesn't come off in the same way that, I think more, left-wing arguments that talk about like America being racist or anything like that come off. It really dodges this sense of being like just hating America. That's something that I think sometimes happens to people who try to make arguments about like, America needs to improve in this way or that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, Yeah, so Myopic also says, I disagree that his rhetoric matches that of Trump. Trump was pretty openly, America sucks right now. It's the Democrats' fault, and I'm the strong man that can fix it. Yeah, it's definitely not a perfect match for what Trump was doing, but in both cases, it was a person showing up and just pointing out, like, look at everything that's wrong going on
Yeah.
right now. So there's some parallel. And then we got a comment also that says JFK believed all the stuff he said about the communists, so I wouldn't call it fear mongering. Yeah, while you were away, I think I used the word fear mongering to
Mhm.
describe Kennedy's stuff about the Cold War. I don't mean to imply that he didn't believe it. I think he probably did believe all this stuff that he was saying about global communism and stuff. I don't think he was lying, but so I don't know what word to use if not fear mongering, because he was definitely like painting it in a very threatening light.
Yeah, I think the constant just like going back to like the issue of communism and the struggle against the Soviet Union is really well done. It is a really good way of relating these issues back to something that was like the defining issue of the time. I thought that was really just, yeah, again, really well done. Specifically, when he ties it into South America, I think that's a really good one as well. Because 1960, this isn't too long since the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which at the time was very much like, oh, what are these dangerous left-wing radicals doing south of the border? I wonder how present that was in Americans' minds at the time, when Kennedy makes reference to FDR and having a good policy of friendship with South and Central America, and that we need to do that by setting a good example here.
Yeah, uh, I'm forgetting exactly what my timeline is with Cuba also, but I know that obviously they're going to to go on to
It'll
have
be coming up very soon.
that'll be coming up very soon. But I think the communist revolution in Cuba had already happened by this point. It's possible I might be wrong about that, but yeah.
I think it has to, because the Bay of Pigs was an operation that had been dreamed
administration than in the previous administration. The same is true of highways. Let's put it in terms that all of us can understand. We often hear gross national product discussed, and in that respect, may I say that when we compare the growth in this administration with that of the previous administration, that then there was a total growth of 11% over 7 years. In this administration, there's been a total growth of 19% over 7 years. That shows that there's been more growth in this administration than in its predecessors. But let's not put it there. Let's put it in terms of the average family. What has happened to you? We find that your wages have gone up 5 times as much in the Eisenhower administration as they did in the Truman administration. What about the prices you pay? We find that the prices you pay went up 5 times as much in the Truman administration as they did in the Eisenhower administration. What's the net result of this? This means that the average family income went up 15% in the Eisenhower years as against 2% in the Truman years. Now, this is not standing still. But good as this record is, may I emphasize, it isn't enough. A record is never something to stand on. It's something to build on. And in building on this record, I believe that we have the secret for progress. We know the way to progress. And I think, first of all, our own record proves that we know the way. Senator Kennedy has suggested that he believes he knows the way. I respect the sincerity with which he makes that suggestion. But on the other hand, when we look at the various programs that he offers, they do not seem to be new. They seem to be simply retreads of the programs of the Truman administration which preceded it. And I would suggest that during the course of the evening, he might indicate those areas in which his programs are new, where they will mean more progress than we had then. What kind of programs are we for? We are for programs that will expand educational opportunities, that will give to all Americans their equal chance for education, for all of the things which are necessary and dear to the hearts of our people. We are for programs, in addition, which will see that our medical care for the aged is much better handled than it is at the present time. Here again, may I indicate that Senator Kennedy and I are not in disagreement as to the aim. We both want to help the old people. We want to see that they do have adequate medical care. The question is the means. I think that the means that I advocate will reach that goal better than the means that he advocates. I could give better examples, but for whatever it is, whether it's in the field of housing or health or medical care or schools or the development of electric power, we have programs which we believe will move America, move her forward and build on the wonderful record that we have made over these past 7.5 years. Now, when we look at these programs, might I suggest that in evaluating them, we often have a tendency to say that the test of a program is how much you're spending. I will concede that in all the areas to which I have referred, Senator Kennedy would have the federal government spend more than I would have it spend. I costed out the cost of the Democratic platform. It runs a minimum of $13.2 billion a year more than we are presently spending to a maximum of $18 billion a year more than we're presently spending. Now, the Republican platform will cost more, too. It will cost a minimum of $4 billion a year more, a maximum of $4.9 billion a year more than we're presently spending. Now, does this mean that his program is better than ours? Not at all. Because it isn't a question of how much the federal government spends. It isn't a question of which government does the most. It's a question of which administration does the right thing. And in our case, I do believe that our programs will stimulate the creative energies of 180 million free Americans. I believe the programs that Senator Kennedy advocates will have a tendency to stifle those creative energies. I believe, in other words, that his programs would lead to the stagnation of the motive power that we need in this country to get progress. The final point that I would like to make is this. Senator Kennedy has suggested in his speeches that we lack compassion for the poor, for the old, and for others that are unfortunate. Let us understand throughout this campaign that his motives and mine are sincere. I know what it means to be poor. I know what it means to see people who are unemployed. I know Senator Kennedy feels as deeply about these problems as I do, but our disagreement is not about the goals for America, but only about the means to reach those goals.
All right, what do you think of that one?
I did not think that was very good.
I agree.
Yeah, I think, he's making some pretty valiant statistical defenses of his administration,
Yeah.
um, which are good. But I think this speech really lacked any sort of like cohesive point. It felt like very much a rebuttal and not so much. It very much felt like he was trying to counter Kennedy instead of assert himself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this really hurts by what is essentially, hey, things are doing good and we need to do the things that we're currently doing, but do them better. I
Yeah.
just don't think that's a very compelling message, and it certainly wasn't presented in a compelling way here.
So I wonder if like if this is like there's a tendency. It's really hard to say this because of small sample size, but it seems like we go. We'll have like a two-term president, then we'll switch to the other party, have a two-term president, and then switch to the other party and have a two-term president. And it seems like this is just kind of the general trend for the American history over the last um, since World War II. Basically, that's what's happening most of the time. And I wonder if that's why is because the very message you're describing there is the message that somebody has to give when they're in Nixon's position.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
I think it is really interesting sometimes to try and analyze the cycles of presidencies. I do think it's sometimes easy though to slip into like I think there are some people that really overemphasize the power of like a presiding president trying to get their second term, things like this, or the idea that people just flip flop it back and forth. Um, but I think yeah, there is something to be said for man, this country loves an underdog story, and loves an outsider sometimes.
yeah, for sure. Okay, so a couple other things that I think were noteworthy. I mean, first of all, these speeches are really long. It's like way more longer than you would see in any like presidential debate today. Like, what do you make
Mhm.
of that?
I thought it was. I mean, I think that 8 minutes is a decent amount of time. I think it really isn't that long. It really, or isn't necessarily long if you're using it well. I think that Kennedy's speech felt way shorter than Nixon's speech, had much better pacing and structure. Kennedy opens up with this framing, hey, it's all about the Soviet Union. We can't, we need to acknowledge that our domestic policy affects our international standing, and then goes into these examples, goes into these attacks. He has the section where he talks about, I'm not satisfied. He goes to specific examples. It was really well structured. And I think you can really tell, whereas Nixon's, it's much more rambling. He starts by making a lot of concessions to Nixon, or excuse me, to Kennedy, which are, I think it's a good strategy. You don't want to fight your opponent on the points that they're just right on. That just makes you look dumb. But I think this is a great example of the danger in conceding too much, where Nixon's like, okay, we agree on this, we agree on this, we agree on this, we agree on this. And that just doesn't come off very good a lot of the time if you're ceding all this ground. Saying, oh, look, okay, look, we agree on this, but we disagree on the means to. You really, I think, then need to amp up, a little bit of your aggression in that disagreement on the means, or else I think you can really come off as being conciliatory in a way where it feels like the opponent has won, especially if the opponent goes first. If both people agree on a big swath of things, going first, I think, is really a huge advantage, because then no matter what anyone says, the entire debate is going to be in people's minds. It's going to be framed as, oh, person who went second agreed with what person who went first said. Even if, we know going into this debate they both hold these same positions. The person who gets to first say the position gets to own it a little bit more. In fact, not just a little bit more, a lot more, I think. And so I think that if that's going to be the case, then you really need to, I think, amp up your aggression in the areas that you do disagree. You can be like, sure, 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 we agree on this, we agree on this, but, and then you really go on. You want to try and minimize the amount of time where you're like, oh, I agree with this, I agree with this, and I think more lean into the time, not to say that it's not a balance, you still want both, but more lean into the time where you're then differentiating yourselves and going on the offensive.
It does seem like Nixon tried to do that, but you're right. He was like much more conciliatory than you would normally ever see in more
Hmm.
recent presidential debates. Like I can't think of one during my lifetime where I've ever heard somebody point out that many agreements with their opponent, and I don't know.
Hmm.
I mean, you get little like moments of niceness here and there where it's like, look, we both want what's best for our country, and then they'll just, however, this, da, 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 da," and like that's about as close as you get in more recent
Hmm.
ones. Um,
Yeah.
on the point about the speeches being long, I would agree that like I think that, like a longer speech time can be good if they use it well, and I think Kennedy did, as you said, and I don't think Nixon's was even bad really. It was just like okay, but it looked bad compared in comparison to
Yeah.
Kennedy. Um,
Tough
but
second act to follow.
like why do you think it is that the more recent debates have cut back on that speaking time?
I mean, it's a great question. I imagine that, I mean, I can theorize it's probably going to come down to some internal decision being made by the people that host the debates. But I mean, I think it's just the case that, people's attention spans for media is much lower these days. It's also the case that I think people want more back and forth rather than sort of rattling on. Yeah, it's important to remember that this is probably one of the first big exposures of direct video of the presidential candidates. So just having them on screen is a big unique thing. Whereas debates today, the unique thing isn't that I can see Donald Trump and Joe Biden on my screen, it's that they're talking to each other. So maybe that could be a metric by which, okay, let's try to minimize the time where they're not talking to each other and maximize the time where they are talking to each other. Because them going back and forth, that's the unique draw of the debates in this media landscape.
Yeah, so this it was literally the first time that presidential candidates had ever debated on television, and I mean prior to this there was like the Lincoln Douglas debates like 100 years earlier,
Yep.
right? This is where Lincoln and Douglas were running for. I'm sorry, they weren't even running for the presidency. They were running for Senate, right? But those debates were like really really famous, and I think they were like the inspiration for the idea of even like bringing back presidential debates in the television era.
Yeah.
But the Lincoln Douglas debates, if I man, I read a little bit about them. Didn't they go on for like literally days, or am I wrong about that?
I think some of them did, yeah. It was the LincolnDouglas debates are hugely significant just for the history of, I think, intellectual sparring in this country as sort of this legendary thing that people talked about for a long, long time and people tried to emulate.
Hmm.
One of the one of the biggest debate categories in this country for competitive debate is called LincolnDouglas Debate. That is just straight up named after that, and it is structured a lot. Is very much structured in the style of to attempt to replicate a lot of what was going on in those LincolnDouglas debates. Um,
Yeah, so I've got to imagine when they were setting up this like Kennedy Nixon debate, they were probably looking back at these like very very long debates that had happened between Lincoln and Douglas, and they were thinking like, oh, we got to cut back on this significantly. And so then when
mhm.
they give them like the 8 minute opening speeches, that's like, well, yeah, we're giving them 8 minutes instead of like what I don't even remember. Like their speeches were like hours in the Lincoln Douglas thing.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, and especially, I mean, back in those days, Lincoln Douglas debates were, probably just about 100 years old. And especially, considering how much sort of slower the world moved back then, people thought would think of those as not nearly as distant as we do. They would probably think of it as much more as about as close as like World War One or maybe even World War Two. Since again, I think there's something to be said for people viewing time moving much faster, with how rapid developments happen. If you look at like the amount of change that happens in the world from like the 80s to today versus like the 1840s to the 1880s, it's a really, I think there's something to be said that time moves a lot quicker.
I mean, certainly, like, there's the amount of technological development that's happened over the last 30, 40 years is probably like as much as would have happened in 100 years back then. Um, So,
Yeah, it's
so
hugely transformational.
yeah. So then anyway, trying to tie this back to the thing about the length of the speeches. I wonder if this was just they took their first guess and then they thought like, no, we really need to cut it back on even further. Like, I wonder if it's actually true that people have shorter attention spans today, because that sounds plausible, and I hear people say it a lot, but it's hard to know. Like, is that actually true, or did they just like not understand as well back then how short people's attention spans really were?
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, I guess the forms of entertainment that people were used to back then would have been radio shows and like reading books and reading newspapers and that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
so that probably does require a longer attention span. So it would have made sense that they
It's
would have.
also just the case that I think this is going to be much more captivating to people just by virtue of having of being the first ever presidential debate. So there's probably a much lower like bar they have to meet to innovate on the show.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So then another thing, they're just not interrupting each other at all. They're just very politely taking turns. Kennedy is like sitting there taking notes. They cut over to him a couple times during Nixon's speech, and it just seems like this very big contrast. Like if you were to click on any of these ones that have Donald Trump, and it's just people like interrupting, talking over each other all the time, and especially like if you look at like the primary debates that we have now, it's like
Oh yeah,
they just put 12
it's
people
like
on
a prime
stage.
case open panel.
No, that's what I was gonna say. You're right. Like they just have a
Yeah.
prime panel, and that's the primary. It's yeah.
Oh man, that's yeah. Lester Holt and Prime trying to hold trying to hold him down. Maybe that's what Prime's training for. He Prime. I mean, now that I think about it, when it comes to like keeping a group of people who are having some political debate from shouting over each other, Prime is probably like in the top 1,000 people in the history of the human race. I mean, here, so
You're
I
right.
mean, he's probably actually really far, disturbingly far up there. I mean, certainly for people that are alive. For people that are alive and in America, when it comes to like experience in like keeping debates civil when there's a bunch of people jumping on in front of a camera, Prime's got to be like top 300. Oh man, that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people you would have to compare him to would be like parliamentary officers around the world, right?
Yeah.
Like people managing parliamentary
Yeah,
debates.
the people. I know it's the UK House of Lords can get really contentious. They're like YouTube compilation videos where it's almost like a verbal sparring for like performance as much as it is like a legitimately trying to sort through the issues.
Yeah, and obviously there have been some famous incidents in real life of people having like actual fist fights during parliamentary debates in other
Hmm.
countries, but
Yeah, maybe those people have Prime beaten on that sort of axis of the moderator.
well, yeah,
I don't know. I don't know
but
if
I think
Prime's ever had to wade in,
well, yeah. It's because Prime
throw some
doesn't
punches.
have to deal with that because we're not there in person. I think if you got
Yeah.
all the people together in a Prime panel in person, like, and if he was doing these in person every night, you might have fist fights, like,
Yeah. So there'd be at least one somewhere, sure.
because I mean, you get people just wandering in drunk on Prime panels all the time, like,
Yeah.
but I mean that probably happens in parliaments too. You probably have like
Yep.
parliamentarians showing up drunk. I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think I don't know. I go back and forth on the question of if our politics have become less civil. Because on the one hand, I think that people do a lot of wax lyrical about, previous eras, about people being more civil, when in reality people, were very civil on the surface. keeps getting, I feel like, bogged down in the nitty-gritty in such a way that just isn't very appealing. When people asked him, when he was asked the question, okay, you're the vice president of this administration, but are you actually doing anything, or are you like the inverse Dick Cheney? Um, I thought, and he sort of goes down this list, changing leaders in the labor field, separate South American lending agencies, Hungarian refugee situations. These just, they're just really not hitting very good. Maybe it's just me, but like, it's difficult to put into words, but it feels like not a very good answer when he's sort of like bumbling through like this list of issues. Maybe these were, much larger issues in the minds of Americans in 1960. When people listen to this, they're like, oh yes, the separate lending agency we have for South America as opposed to the other lending agencies that we have for the entire world. Yes, the Hungarian refugee situation. Maybe that is the case, and I just don't realize that. But I find that kind of hard to believe. It feels like Nixon's almost coming off like a bit of an egghead, like a bit of a nerd, to be honest.
Yeah.
In how he's going through these, and again, just doesn't have like a cohesive like vision. It feels like like the way that the way that like JFK would have answered this question, I think he would have, started with a broad overview and then gone to the specifics and then returned related to them back. Whereas Nixon just sort of immediately goes into the bullet points. And, going to bullet points isn't necessarily wrong, but then the way that he's going through them as well, kind of bumbling, and just not very like confident, feels kind of weak, I think. There's a moment where he says, I have made other. He makes reference to, oh, there's lots of others. And then he realizes, oh, I should actually go into those and do them. Very similar, in his opening, he did a similar thing, where he said, I could go into better examples. When he was talking about the statistics that were better in the Eisenhower administration than the Truman administration, he also, again, said something similar along the lines of, I could go into better examples. These are things you should really never, ever say. Because it just comes off as just like total, like, first off, okay, just tell us then, which he then goes on to do. And then even when he does them, it still just comes off as like, okay, wow, dude, like, I guess I'll just take your word for it. Like, oh, you actually have examples that prove you're right? Oh, I didn't realize you would think that. I guess that totally changes my mind. Like, no, I need to see these, obviously. I think that just rhetorically, Nixon is really getting killed here.
Yeah, Changebox in chat agrees with you. He says Nixon's not speaking to the emotions of the voters, and I agree with you as well. And I think you were right to tie this back to their opening speeches, where the thing was that like Kennedy had a very clear theme and a very clear message, and then Nixon is just trying to display that he knows more about the facts of the issues or something. It's like that's as close as I can get to like a theme that he's trying to present. Which is good. Like, of course, I'd rather have a president that knows a lot about issues, but it doesn't really work that well in terms of messaging.
Yeah, it really is. It's not necessarily the presence of going into these stats, but it's the lack of like a rhetorical side. The problem with Nixon right now is that he's got like the hard numbers and stuff like that, but he doesn't have any structure or delivery to what he's saying, and you gotta have that. He has the medicine, he doesn't have the sugar, and you really need the sugar.
Yeah, I agree.
Senator Kennedy from Mr. Warren. Senator Kennedy, during your brief speech a few minutes ago, you mentioned farm surpluses. I'd like to ask this. It's a fact, I think, the presidential candidates traditionally make promises to farmers. Lots of people, I think, don't understand why the government pays farmers for not producing certain crops, or paying farmers if they overproduce, for that matter. Now, let me ask, sir, why can't the farmer operate like the businessman who operates a factory? If an auto company overproduces a certain model car, Uncle Sam doesn't step in and buy up the surplus. Why this constant courting of the farmer?
Well, because I think that if the federal government moved out of the program and withdrew its support, then I think you would have complete economic chaos. The farmer plants in the spring and harvests in the fall. There are hundreds of thousands of them. They're not able to control their market very well. They bring their crops in or their livestock in, many of them about the same time. They have only a few purchasers that buy their milk or their hogs, few large companies in many cases, and therefore the farmer is not in a position to bargain very effectively in the marketplace. I think the experience of the 20s has shown what a free market could do to agriculture. And if the agricultural economy collapses, then the economy of the rest of the United States sooner or later will collapse. The farmers are the number one market for the automobile industry of the United States. The automobile industry is the number one market for steel. So if the farmers' economy continues to decline as sharply as it has in recent years, then I think you would have a recession in the rest of the country. So I think the case for the government intervention is a good one. Secondly, my objection to present farm policy is that there are no effective controls to bring supply and demand into better balance. The dropping of the support price in order to limit production does not work. And we now have the highest surpluses, $9 billion worth. We've had a higher tax load from the Treasury for the farmer in the last few years with the lowest farm income in many years. I think that this farm policy has failed. And my judgment, the only policy that will work will be for effective supply and demand to be in balance. And that can only be done through governmental action. I therefore suggest that in those basic commodities which are supported, that the federal government, after endorsement
this. Through the years, I have sat in the National Security Council. I have been in the cabinet. I have met with the legislative leaders. I have met with the president when he made the great decisions with regard to Lebanon, Kimoy Matsu, other matters. The president has asked for my advice. I have given it. Sometimes my advice has been taken. Sometimes it is not. I do not say that I have made the decision. And I would say that no president should ever allow anybody else to make the major decisions. The president only makes the decisions. All that his advisors do is to give counsel when he asks for it. As far as what experience counts and whether that is experience that counts, that isn't for me to say. I can only say that my experience is there for the people to consider. Senator Kennedy's is there for the people to consider. As he pointed out, we came to the Congress in the same year. His experience has been different from mine. Mine has been in the executive branch. His has been in the legislative branch. I would say that the people now have the opportunity to evaluate his as against mine, and I think both he and I are going to abide by whatever the people decide.
Senator Kennedy?
I'm kind of amazed that he was able to give that good of an answer on the spot. Like, I guess I'm not sure if this is edited at all, but like, can you imagine being asked a question like that? He's got to be so pissed.
Yeah, I mean, if that he starts by saying that that was a facetious remark, man. If it was, then that is that's a brutal. I mean, regardless whether or not it was or wasn't facetious, that's a horrible spot to be put in his Nixon. But if it was a joke, man, that has Eisenhower must really be kicking himself for sabotaging his vice president like that unintentionally. I mean, yeah, I have no idea. I'm actually super curious. I kind of want to look that up after this. Um, I thought that, Nixon came out the other side of that, about as well as you could in this scenario.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things, there are a couple more times here where I feel like Nixon is really not making the case for himself enough here. This is starting to become a consistent theme. He says, he says in reference to whether or not his experience is better, that isn't for me to say. He says our experiences are different. You should not be doing this. You should be saying, here's the difference, and this is this is why mine is better. I mean, I can't imagine someone like Donald Trump or any modern politician these days being like, "Oh, there are differences, but who's between me and my opposition? But who's to say which of us is better?" Like that's for the people to decide. Like
It's sad
that
that they
is
can't do that though, right? Like, because I'm sympathetic to what Nixon appears to be trying to do, right? He's like, well, the voters are going to be very fair-minded about this. I'll just appeal to the wisdom of their judgment, or like.
Mm, I think it's I do not like the idea of just pointing out a difference and then saying it's up to you, the audience, to decide. Because I think that you should really be digging into the details and making the case as to why you think one part of the reason of these debates is to see the clashing of ideas, like, well, what is better? Experience in the executive or experience in the legislative, experience in this administration. And I would much prefer, I think, for Nixon to say something like, I think my experience as administration is good, and then because we did these policies that are good. And then JFK to say, no, this administration is actually bad. These things that this administration doing aren't good, so that experience isn't good. Or it's better for there to have someone with more legislative experience or something, rather than just be like, well, we are different. Well, you decide. Like, motherfucker, I'm here to hear you make the case for why your difference is better. I'm sure, Nixon, you think that you would be better, so tell me.
Yeah, so if you look at it from the point of view of like you just want Nixon to be the most effective advocate for himself that he can be, then like contingent on that, I totally agree with what you said. It's just I don't know. I think it's like a little bit of a sad commentary on the on the world that he can't just be a little bit honest about the about the fact that it's like, well, look, like each of us have our pros and cons, and like I don't know.
I can see that more, but I think I actually do. Maybe I'm just a little sick in the head. I am a glutton for these kinds of debates that a lot of people find annoying and stuff. But I definitely prefer. I think it's a sad commentary that Nixon is doing this. He should Giga chat it up, get some better energy in this room, and I think really take his case, really take JFK to task over his experience here.
If we think of it as similar to a courtroom, then I think I can like like, okay, you know how the attorneys for each side, the prosecution and the defense, their job is not to do what Nixon is doing here. Their job is just to present the most effective case for their side, right?
Hmm.
So I don't know.
Say that the question is of experience, and the question also is what our judgment is of the future, and what our goals are for the United States, and what ability we have to implement those goals. Abraham Lincoln came to the presidency in 1860 after a rather little-known session in the House of Representatives, and after being defeated for the Senate in 58 and was a distinguished president. There is no certain road to the presidency. There are no guarantees that if you take one road or another that you will be a successful president. I have been in the Congress for 14 years. I have voted in the last 8 years. When the Vice President was presiding over the Senate and meeting his other responsibilities, I have met decisions over 800 times on matters which affect not only the domestic security of the United States, but as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The question really is, which candidate and which party can meet the problems that the United States is going to face in the 60s?
The next question to Senator Kennedy from Mr.
You know
Noble.
what? I actually kind of didn't like that answer from Kennedy that much. I felt like he wasn't really
Yeah,
addressing the
remarkably
question very
non-engaging.
directly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is the first time that Kennedy really hasn't looked very good. He just didn't really have much to say there and didn't really engage with what Nixon said.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Kennedy, in connection with these problems of the future that you speak of and the program that you enunciated earlier in your direct talk, you call for expanding some of the welfare programs for schools, for teacher salaries, medical care, and so forth, but you also call for reducing the federal debt. And I'm wondering how you, if you're president in January, would go about paying the bill for all this. Does this mean that
I did not advocate reducing the federal debt because I don't believe that you're going to be able to reduce the federal debt very much in 1961, 2, or 3. I think you have heavy obligations which affect our security, which we're going to have to meet. And therefore, I've never suggested we should be able to retire the debt substantially or even at all in 1961 or 2.
Senator, I believe in one of your speeches you
never.
suggested that reducing the interest rate would help toward...
No, not reducing the interest. Reducing the interest rate, in my judgment, the hard money, tight money policy, fiscal policy of this administration has contributed to the slowdown in our economy, which helped bring the recession of 54, which made the recession of 58 rather intense, and which has slowed somewhat our economic activity in 1960. What I have talked about, however, the kind of programs that I talked about, in my judgment, are fiscally sound. Medical care for the aged, I would put under Social Security. The Vice President and I disagree on this. The program, the Javits-Nixon or the Nixon-Javits program, would have cost, if fully used, $600 million by the government per year and $600 million by the state. The program which I advocated, which failed by 5 votes in the United States Senate, would have put medical care for the aged in Social Security and would have been paid for through the Social Security system and the Social Security tax. Secondly, I support federal aid to education and federal aid for teacher salaries. I think that's a good investment. I think we're going to have to do it. And I think to heap the burden further on the property tax, which is already strained in many of our communities, will ensure, in my opinion, that many of our children will not be adequately educated and many of our teachers not adequately compensated. There is no greater return to an economy or to a society than an educational system second to none. On the question of the development of natural resources, I would pay as you go, in the sense that they would be balanced and the power revenues would bring back sufficient money to finance the projects, in the same way as the Tennessee Valley. I believe in the balanced budget, and the only conditions under which I would unbalance the budget would be if there was a grave national emergency or a serious recession. Otherwise, with a steady rate of economic growth, and Mr. Nixon and Mr. Rockefeller in their meeting said a 5% economic growth would bring by 1962 $10 billion extra in tax revenues. Whatever is brought in, I think that we can finance essential programs within a balanced budget if business remains orderly.
Yes, I think what Mr. Noble is referring to was not one of Senator Kennedy's speeches, but the Democratic platform, which did mention cutting the national debt. I think, too, that it should be pointed out that, of course, it is not possible, particularly under the proposals that Senator Kennedy has advocated, either to cut the national debt or to reduce taxes. As a matter of fact, it will be necessary to raise taxes. As Senator Kennedy points out, that as far as his one proposal is concerned, the one for medical care for the aged, that would be financed out of Social Security. That, however, is raising taxes. for those who pay Social Security. He points out that he would make pay-as-you-go be the basis for our natural resources development. For our natural resources development, which I also support incidentally, however, whenever you appropriate money for one of these projects, you have to pay now and appropriate the money, and while they eventually do pay out, it doesn't mean that the government doesn't have to put out the money this year. And so I would say that in all of these proposals Senator Kennedy has made, they will result in one of two things. Either he has to raise taxes or he has to unbalance the budget. If he unbalances the budget, that means you have inflation, and that will be, of course, a very cruel blow to the very people, the older people that we've been talking about. As far as aid for school construction is concerned, I favor that, as Senator Kennedy did in January of this year, when he said he favored that rather than aid to teacher salaries. I favor that because I believe that's the best way to aid our schools without running any risk whatever of the federal government telling our teachers what to teach.
The next question to Vice President Nixon from Mr. Warren. Mr. Vice President, you mentioned schools. It was just yesterday, I think you asked for a crash program to raise education standards. And this evening you talked about advances in...
That was really interesting with Nixon's response, I thought.
Why is that?
Nixon points out that, so there's this quibble with JFK and the reporter talking about whether or not JFK said that. And JFK clarifies that he didn't say that quite strongly, which I thought came off very good. And then he goes into this question of specifically what would these policies specifically be that would be, he sort of transitions, even though the question is now effectively a dud, he still finds a way to be like, well, let me use this opportunity to talk about my policies and how they're awesome. Let's start talking about that. And Nixon then sort of goes in and winds the question back to, that wasn't JFK, that was a Democratic Party policy, but then sort of follows JFK to the ground he went to. When I think there was a real opportunity for him to be like, hey, if we're voting in JFK, he doesn't get to wage. That is a continuation of the same theme that he starts with in his opening speech, where he talks about how the Republican Party for the last 2 decades has been voting for these policies or been voting against federal funding for education and things like these. Really well done by Kennedy to have certain thematic through lines present in his speech, where he keeps hitting on the same point. Very easy to follow and very effective at really drilling into people's heads.
Yeah, Kennedy is doing a lot of this stuff. Like, your policies are really hurting disadvantaged people. They're hurting poor people. They're hurting black people, whoever it is that he's mentioning. They're hurting teachers. Whereas Nixon is just trying to dispute him on technical facts most of the time.
Yeah,
Like,
the closest thing that Nixon has is that actually we agree on a lot of things. That's really not a good like thesis statement to have in a presidential debate.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, my views are a little different. First of all, I don't see how it's possible for a 1/3 of a body, such as the Republicans have in the House and the Senate, to stop 2/3 if the 2/3 are adequately led. I would say, too, that when Senator Kennedy refers to the action of the House Rules Committee, there are 8 Democrats on that committee and 4 Republicans. It would seem to me, again, that it is very difficult to blame the 4 Republicans for the 8 Democrats not getting something through that particular committee. I would say further that to blame the president and his veto power for the inability of the senator and his colleague to get action in this special session misses the mark. When the president exercises his veto power, he has to have the people behind him, not just 1/3 of the Congress. Because let's consider it. If the majority of the members of the Congress felt that these particular proposals were good issues, the majority of those who were Democrats, why didn't they pass them and send them to the president and get a veto and have an issue? The reason why these particular bills in these various fields that have been mentioned were not passed was not because the president was against them. It was because the people were against them. It was because they were too extreme. And I am convinced that the alternate proposals that I have, that the Republicans have in the field of health, in the field of education, in the field of welfare, because they are not extreme, because they will accomplish the end without too great cost in dollars or in freedom, that they could get through the next Congress.
The next question.
I thought that was a
Vice
really good
President Nixon.
answer.
I think that's a really good answer. This is again, I think, where when the line by line on the specific details are not like stats, but are instead like pieces of like logic or details about the situation that can help recontextualize it. I think Nixon's at his strongest there, when he can be like, well, there were enough Democrats to get a veto, but you couldn't get all the Democrats on board, which number one suggests that this policy might not be such a good idea if even Democrats are disagreeing on it. And number two undermines the idea that you, as this vigorous Democratic leader, just need people to vote in some more Democrats and then you can get it all done because you already have enough Democrats.
Yeah, and this was also like probably one of the closest things that Nixon has yet done to making like a genuine emotional appeal, when he's like, look, dude, the people are against this. It's not just us.
Yeah, he then connects those specific details to a bigger statement, a bigger claim, which is that JFK's policies and the policies of this particular wing of the Democratic Party are extreme, and the people do not support them. Very much not just like a case of like, oh, we're in a democracy, but like sort of like an appeal to like the sort of middle American like moderation of being like, oh, do we need all these, fancy spangled crazy ideas, or can't we just use some common sense?
Yeah.
Very much an appeal of that vein, and very well done by Nixon.
Yeah, so let me see if I understand this correctly. Like, it sounds like this bill never actually made it to the president and didn't actually get vetoed. Did I get that right?
That's my interpretation based off of this 3-minute back and forth.
Okay, so based on that understanding of what happened, I also think Nixon was really effective on the point about the veto. He's like, look, this motherfucker is trying to tell us that we can't get this bill passed because of a veto that didn't even happen. It's like, and he's just pointing out like no, it doesn't actually make sense to say that you couldn't get this done because of a veto. Like, Congress couldn't even get it done, and not only that, but you're blaming the minority in Congress for not being able to get this done when you couldn't even get your shit together to do it. So don't even fucking blame it on us.
Yeah, when Nixon's like, fundamentally, your inability to overcome the veto doesn't betray a need for a Republican president. It betrays the fact that you couldn't get a two-thirds majority. Why? Because even Democrats think that these plans go too far.
Yeah.
From Mr.
By the
Flynn.
way, this is about
Mr. Vice President, do I
$1.25
take
minimum wage.
Oh
Going
yeah,
way too
that's
far. So
yeah.
like
That
I don't know the the economics of that time. Like maybe $1.25 was outrageously high at the time. I just don't know. But it like so like none of this is like me trying to comment on the substance of whether it really was too far. It's just that I thought Nixon's answer was apparently effective.
Yeah, I think that has been. There are a couple other times where there are certain things that just sort of like remind you, like, oh yeah, this is happening in 1960. Like this debate happened like over 60 years ago.
Hmm.
Is pretty crazy thing about it. There was I think in his opening, Kennedy mentioned Jimmy Hoffa. I thought that
Yeah.
was really funny. I was like, oh, Jimmy Hoffa's coming up in the opening like statement for this presidential debate. Or when I think it was Nixon said Peking instead of Beijing, so the
Yeah.
out of date Romanization. Yeah, just a couple of things that I think are really funny. Like, oh yeah, this is the 1960s. I almost forgot.
And they used
threat is external and will continue.
Can you even imagine a
Mr.
question
Nixon,
like that
comment?
today? I mean, I think the closest equivalent today is maybe you could get a Republican candidate saying, "Well, what about right-wing white nationalist terrorists or something like that?"
Hmm. Yeah, I think JFK keeps answers short and sweet, and it is to his benefit. Obviously, these kinds of accusations are always going to bite more against a left-leaning person than a right-leaning person. Famously, Nixon was like the biggest, only Nixon can go to China. That phrase comes out of the fact that no Nixon could go to China without anyone being suspicious of his communist sympathies because Nixon was the biggest anti-communist there was. It was unquestionable how much he was an anti-communist. So I think JFK is smart to say it's real, it's important. We need to sustain the DOJ, the FBI. We need to maintain a strong society, but the biggest threat is not our communist radicals inside American society. It's the communist radicals who run the Russian nuclear arsenal.
Yeah, and so this, by the way, is 6 years after the McCarthy hearings were happening. To
Hmm.
put that in context, which was
Oh
basically
wow.
almost like a witch hunt against supposed communism in the
Hmm.
American
Yeah,
government or
arguably at like almost their zenith.
yeah. So I don't know. It's just really interesting to hear politicians getting accused of being associated with extremism on their own side of the political spectrum, and then just immediately like agreeing and disavowing them.
Hmm.
Like I just don't hear any. I can't remember the last time I've heard a politician or an American politician at least do something like that.
Yeah, I think, there's a really interesting point that JFK just lightly touches on that you can go super in depth on, and that is the question of like he mentions if we maintain a strong society, we can meet internal threats. Basically, if people like living their lives in America, then we don't have a lot to worry about with revolutionaries, right? And like that's totally true. A lot of these revolutions are usually premised on like some horrible thing happening and undermining the material conditions of people. People need to be kind of starving in the streets sometimes to really commit to radical action on a mass scale, or something equivalent. And I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had there where JFK could talk about, if we could, move forward on these policies, and make our society better, it's the left wing policies that would make our society better that would alleviate the things that cause these people to feel like their society needs to change. It's the Republican policies that keep us tarred down in this and make us weak. To communist infiltration, and they're the ones that are then trying to benefit off of it by, then going on these crazy witch hunts. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't want to go that far during the times because people wouldn't view it as a witch hunt. But I think there's a really interesting angle to explore that question of like subversive ideologies and where they come from.
Yeah, for sure. Geez, I had a comment a second ago and then I already forgot what it was. Oh well, whatever.
I agree with Senator Kennedy's appraisal generally in this respect. The question of communism within the United States has been one that has worried us in the past. It is one that will continue to be a problem for years to come. We have to remember that the Cold War that Mr. Khrushchev is waging and his colleagues are waging is waged all over the world, and it's waged right here in the United States. That's why we have to continue to be alert. It is also essential in being alert that we be fair. Fair because by being fair, we uphold the very freedoms that the communists would destroy. We uphold the standards of conduct which they would never follow. And in this connection, I think that we must look to the future, having in mind the fact that we fight communism at home, not only by our laws to deal with communists, the few who do become communists and the few who do become fellow travelers, but we also fight communism at home by moving against those various injustices which exist in our society, which the communists feed upon. And in that connection, I again would say, that while Senator Kennedy says we are for the status quo, I do believe that he would agree that I am just as sincere in believing that my proposals for federal aid to education, my proposals for health care, are just as sincerely held as his. The question, again, is not one of goals. We're for those goals. It's one of means.
Mr. Van Oker's question
I
for Vice
remembered what I
President
was going to
Nixon.
say earlier, which was that the thing that Kennedy said was tying back to the theme of his opening statement.
Yep. And speaking of tying back to your themes of opening statements, I feel like this is getting away from the strong Nixon responses and back to the weak ones. When this is an angle that I think he could be uniquely leveraged against JFK, and he's opening with like, I agree. I think again that's really a problem of just being way too conciliatory in a way that just makes you look bad. And then Nixon getting again bogged down all these really technical details, ones that I don't think are effective or interesting for people to listen to.
Yeah, and it's funny, like you were saying a minute ago that Nixon's like known as one of the most anti-communist people, but he doesn't really appear to be coming across that way in this answer.
Yeah,
Like you would think this question would be the opportunity for him to show that off if he wanted to, but he isn't really doing it.
exactly. Yeah. Oh, just skipped us back a bit. Let me cover our time. I think we were.
Could work for Democratic majorities in the House and Senate.
I would say this, that we, of course, expect to pick up.
Okay, yeah, this is the previous question about the Nixon.
In your proposal, it was not an extreme bill, and yet we could not get.
Bill.
How serious a threat to our national
Okay,
security?
it's the communist subversives
Are these
questions. That's
communist
JFK's
subversive-
response, then Nixon's response here.
The question of communism home, not only by our laws to deal with communism, the few who do become communists and the few who do become fellow travelers, but we also fight communism at home by moving against those various injustices. Sincere in believing that my proposals for better aid education, my proposals for health care are just as sincerely held as his. The question, again, is not one of goals. We're for those goals. It's one of means.
Mr. Van Oker's question for Vice President Nixon.
Mr. Vice President, in one of your earlier statements, you said, we've moved ahead, we've built more schools, we've built more hospitals. Now, sir, isn't it true that the building of more schools is a local matter for financing? Were you claiming that the Eisenhower administration was responsible for the building of these schools, or is it the local school districts that provide for them?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, your question brings out a point that I'm very glad to make. Too often, in appraising whether we are moving ahead or not, we think only of what the federal government is doing. Now, that isn't the test of whether America moves. The test of whether America moves is whether the federal government, plus the state government, plus the local government, plus the biggest segment of all, individual enterprise, moves. We have, for example, a gross national product of approximately $500 billion. Roughly $100 billion to $125 billion of that is the result of government activity. $400 billion, approximately, is a result of what individuals do. Now, the reason the Eisenhower administration has moved, the reason that we've had the funds, for example, locally, to build the schools and the hospitals and the highways, to make the progress that we have, is because this administration has encouraged individual enterprise. And it has resulted in the greatest expansion of the private sector of the economy that has ever been witnessed in an 8-year period. And that is growth. That is the growth that we are looking for. It is the growth that this administration has supported and that its policies have stimulated.
Senator Kennedy?
Well, I must say, I think the reason that the schools have been constructed is because the local school districts were willing to increase the property taxes to a tremendously high figure. In my opinion, almost the point of diminishing returns in order to sustain these schools. Secondly, I think we have a rich country, and I think we have a powerful country. I think what we have to do, however, is have the president and the leadership set before our country exactly what we must do in the next decade if we're going to maintain our security in education, in economic growth, in development of natural resources. The Soviet Union is making great gains. It isn't enough to compare what might have been done 8 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. I want to compare what we're doing with what our adversaries are doing, so that by the year 1970, the United States is ahead in education, in health, in building, in homes, in economic strength. I think that's the big assignment, the big task, the big function of the federal government.
And I have the
Kennedy is really like hammering that Cold War theme. I felt like it was not actually a very good answer to the question that he gave, but he just took it as an opportunity to talk about why education matters to him, as opposed to like, more specifically what the question was about.
Yeah, I think Kennedy's basically just using this as an opportunity to speak, because when the question to Nixon, how do you balance, Mr. Nixon, you said that, it was that the building these schools was good, but that was done by the federal government. As a conservative, how do you make sure you don't go too far? There's not really much for JFK to really say in response to that when this is a question more coming from a right-leaning perspective, almost criticizing Nixon for being too willing to engage in big government.
Yeah. Although I mean, I thought Nixon's answer was okay though.
Yeah, I thought it was a good answer, I thought.
I mean, it was like, well, we value private enterprise a lot, so despite whatever you may have to say about this, like that's not the center of where our values are at, and you can try, whatever, like his whole
Yeah,
thing.
I thought Nixon's response was a good answer, and I think what JFK is basically doing here, and I think it's actually well advised, is he's providing the alternate worldview. When Nixon says, the test of if America moves is a question of, state, local, private enterprise, in addition to federal government. And then JFK steps in and says, we need federal government to guide, to set the plan of what we should do. That's basically like the alternate view. And so I do think it's good for him to mention that, and then to bring in contention. Well, why do we need this view? Because the Soviet Union is here. We need to be comparing ourselves not to what we did 20 years ago, but to what the Soviet Union is doing today. I thought that was a great line to really illustrate the point of why we need, of why, from JFK's perspective, we need a much more involved federal government that is doing things and setting the standard and showing local state governments the pathway.
Yeah, it's funny because like it's the kind of thing that I would have expected Nixon to say more than I would have expected Kennedy to say before having watched this debate, right? Like I would have expected Nixon to be the one saying like we need to do things my way because you know because of the threat of communism, but instead it's just Kennedy doing that over and over.
Yeah, it's kind of reminds me of an interesting schism that you'll sometimes see on the right between like more like standard right wingers versus more of the libertarian leanings, where they both agree, oh, we love freedom, we love small government, but then libertarians will be opposed to using the power of our big government to secure the small government things that we like across the world. It's the thing where, certain right wingers will be like, libertarians hate communism, but they aren't willing to like raise taxes by 5% to stop it. Is like a criticism that sometimes will be made of more libertarian leaning Republicans by those Republicans that are willing to utilize the state to really uh, leverage American interest abroad.
Mm-hmm.
Summation time, please. We've completed our questions and our comments, and in just a moment we'll have the summation time.
This will allow 3 minutes and 20 seconds for the summation by each candidate.
Closing
3 minutes and 20 seconds for each candidate.
So.
Vice President Nixon, will you make the first summation?
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
They're saying summation, but earlier they made reference to closing.
First of all, I think it is
closing.
well to put in perspective where we really do stand with regard to the Soviet Union in this whole matter of growth. The Soviet Union has been moving faster than we have. But the reason for that is obvious. They start from a much lower base. Although they have been moving faster in growth than we have, we find, for example, today, that their total gross national product is only 44% of our total gross national product. That's the same percentage that it was 20 years ago. And as far as the absolute gap is concerned, we find that the United States is even further ahead than it was 20 years ago. Is this any reason for complacency? Not at all. Because these are determined men. They are fanatical men. And we have to get the very most out of our economy. I agree with Senator Kennedy completely on that scope. Where we disagree is in the means that we would use to get the most out of our economy. I respectfully submit that Senator Kennedy too often would rely too much on the federal government, on what it would do to solve our problems, to stimulate growth. I believe that when we examine the Democratic platform, when we examine the proposals that he has discussed tonight, when we compare them with the proposals that I have made, that these proposals that he makes would not result in greater growth for this country than would be the case if we followed the programs that I have advocated. There are many of the points that he has made that I would like to comment upon. The one in the field of health is worth mentioning. Our health program, the one that Senator Javits and other Republican senators, as well as I, supported, is one that provides for all people over 65 who want health insurance the opportunity to have it if they want it. It provides a choice of having either government insurance or private insurance.
Nixon proposed Obamacare,
But it compels
basically, by
nobody
the way.
to have insurance who does not want it. His program under Social Security would require everybody who had Social Security to take government health insurance whether he wanted it or not. And it would not cover several million people who are not covered by Social Security at all. Here is one place where I think that our program does a better job than his. The other point that I would make is this. This downgrading of how much things cost, I think many of our people will understand better when they look at what happened during the Truman administration, when the government was spending more than it took in. We found savings over a lifetime eaten up by inflation. We found the people who could least afford it, people on retired incomes, people on fixed incomes, we found them unable to meet their bills at the end of the month. It is essential that a man who's president of this country certainly stand for every program that will mean for growth. And I stand for programs that will mean growth and progress. But it is also essential that he not allow a dollar spent that could be better spent by the people themselves.
Senator Kennedy, your conclusion?
I want to call back to something you said earlier, Flowtrace, where you were saying that like when the two of them agree on something, that it appears advantageous for the person who said it first, and like that came to mind as soon as Nixon finally invoked the communism thing. It's like, because it looks like he's either reluctantly admitting that Kennedy was right all along, or he's just like hopping on the bandwagon of whatever Kennedy said. And like, really, that's not like a fair impression to get of something that they presumably have both agreed on the entire time, but it just kind of looks that way.
Yeah, it's not as if, people are listening to this debate and then going to their notes and looking like, well, how does this actually affect their argument? Does this change anything about JFK's plan? It's more of like a feeling, I think, like a holistic feeling based off of a lot of things. And that is really not contributing to people having a good feeling about you, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, they didn't have Twitch streamers doing flowcharts of their debate, unfortunately.
Yeah,
so
unfortunately,
it's all about the feels.
If only we were there, Cricket, we could have made sure that Nixon got elected in 1960.
I'm not so sure I'd want to, but I really don't know.
Yeah, probably not.
Probably not.
This closing statement I thought was pretty good until the end when he goes off to this tangent about the healthcare plan. It felt like he opened with a good, it felt like he had a pretty good thesis statement here. This is like what his opening should have been, I think. In a closing statement, you don't want to go get bogged down in new details. You want to summarize and you want to make reference. So if Nixon, so I think what Nixon should have done if he wanted to get into healthcare points is he says that the difference is not in our goal, but how we get there. And the way that JFK wants to get there, he specifically says JFK relies too often on the federal government. And then instead of saying, now, there are many points we could talk about. Let's talk about healthcare. Instead, he should say, JFK relies too often on the federal government. Whether it's healthcare plan, which forces you to take healthcare instead of offering a choice like my plan. Whether it's, and then boom, boom, boom. Go down like 4 of these with quick references to, like money shots, like things where that people are not going to like. For example, because it is a good thing to go to the fact that JFK's plan doesn't give you choice. People don't like that, right? That's like an easy win where you can be like, oh, scary government, you don't get to choose. That's why Obama hammered, when Obama did Obamacare, he hammered, if you like your doctor, you get to keep it. Because people really do not like the idea, at least in America, of the government coming in and forcing you to choose what doctor, what plan you do. I think that is what Nixon should have done here. Instead of getting really bogged down in the details of one of these, he should have made reference to already established details throughout the debate. He should be going, remember when JFK wanted federal funding for schools? Another example of the federal government. JFK uses federal government too much. Like, remember when we were talking about federal funding for schools and he wanted that? That's a great example. Or remember we were talking about this or this or this. And then close up his statement in a nice little bow. But instead, it feels like this disjointed mess of like really good overview, sort of doing broad strokes of the debate, and then we're gonna do like a minute 30 of like specifics on like a healthcare bill now, and that just isn't the place to do that. Isn't the closing statement, I think.
Yeah, and I think everything you're describing is really just it's not even like a substantive change to what he's saying. It's really more just like these small wording changes that really do make it sound a lot more compelling. I agree.
It was made by Mr. Nixon that the Soviet production is only 44% of ours. I must say that 44% in that Soviet country is causing us a good deal of trouble tonight. I want to make sure that it stays in that relationship. I don't want to see the day when it's 60% of ours and 70 and 75 and 80 and 90% of ours, with all the force and power that it could bring to bear in order to cause our destruction. Secondly, the Vice President mentioned medical care for the aged. Our program was an amendment to the Kerr bill. The Kerr bill provided assistance to all those who were not on Social Security. I think it's a very clear contrast. 1935, when the Social Security Act was written, 94 out of 95 Republicans voted against it. Mr. Landon ran in 1936 to repeal it. In August of 1960, when we tried to get it again, but this time for medical care, we received the support of one Republican in the Senate on this occasion. Thirdly, I think the question before the American people is, as they look at this country and as they look at the world around them, the goals are the same for all Americans. The means are at question. The means are at issue. If you feel that everything that is being done now is satisfactory, that the relative power and prestige and strength of the United States is increasing in relation to that of the communists, that we are gaining more security, that we are achieving everything as a nation that we should achieve, that we're achieving a better life for our citizens and greater strength, then I agree. I think you should vote for Mr. Nixon. But if you feel that we have to move again in the 60s, that the function of the president is to set before the people the unfinished business of our society, as Franklin Roosevelt did in the 30s, the agenda for our people, what we must do as a society to meet our needs in this country and protect our security and help the cause of freedom. As I said at the beginning, the question before us all, that faces all Republicans and all Democrats, is, can freedom in the next generation conquer, or are the communists going to be successful? That's the great issue. And if we meet our responsibilities, I think freedom will conquer. If we fail to move ahead, if we fail to develop sufficient military and economic and social strength here in this country, then I think that the tide could begin to run against us. And I don't want historians 10 years from now to say, these were the years when the tide ran out for the United States. I want them to say, these were the years when the tide came in. These were the years when the United States started to move again. That's the question before the American people, and only you can decide what you want this country to be, what you want to do with the future. I think we're ready to move, and it is to that great task, if we're successful, that we will address ourselves.
Yeah, so Kennedy sticks to his main theme a lot better. And I also really like the move that you were just commenting on, where he goes like, well, if you think we're already doing enough, go ahead and vote for Nixon. And I think if he had done that at any other time in the debate, I would have thought it was a bad move, because that's the kind of comment that I would expect Nixon could like pretty easily rebut if given a chance to. But instead, he's just like, no, here's the last word, and then throws that.
Yeah, that's the power of the closing statement, especially because he's not really making a new claim of, what is literally happening. Like, he's not saying, Nixon supported this policy, which led to a 13% increase in Statistic 37. Statistic 37 is really bad, guys.
Yeah.
He's framing the debate and the differences in a way that is just absolutely murdering Nixon. This is the power of getting to speak last in a debate, and it is a very, very powerful one.
No, and also Nixon has probably like at least twice, maybe more, done the thing where he goes, well, I could tell you all kinds of examples, and then just didn't do it, or only did it later, or
One
like
or
said
two.
there are lots of examples and then just gave one, which is like, on a logical level, there's really nothing wrong with that. Like it makes sense that you would say like, well, there are many examples, but I don't have time for it, but like I get why it looks kind of weak, because it sounds like he's alluding to things that he can't back up, where Kennedy is really not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
He's not like making promises he can't keep or whatever, rhetorically.
It was really interesting because Kennedy's closing starts with quibbling over these two little points, one about the 40% and one about the idea that the Soviet Union's only 40% of the capacity of the United States, and then one about the amendment to healthcare. which is something I normally wouldn't do in a conclusion. But I think I actually really like what he does here is where he does those really quickly, gets them out of the way, and then devotes the meat of his closing to the actual closing statement, which is this holistic view, painting the broad picture of what was said and then how it relates to you. And I think he actually does a really good, he does here what I think Nixon failed to do, which is he says, the decision is yours, the American people. But he does that after painting a clear picture that portrays the choice as like pretty obvious, right? Where he's saying, hey, if you think that we're doing fine, there are a couple specific words. If you feel that everything being done now is fine, that the gap between us and the communists are growing, that we have more security, he says specifically that we are doing everything we need to do. Obviously, these impossible standards that no administration, no matter how good it is, would be able to meet. And he says, then no problem. Go ahead and vote for Nixon. But if you agree, and that's just absolutely genius.
No,
Sorry, go
it's a
ahead.
really good contrast against what Nixon tried to do earlier in the debate, where
Yes.
he tried to be like really fair about it and go like, well, look, like there are some good things about Kennedy, and you can look at those and make up your own mind, and instead like, yeah,
And especially when he uses that specific phrase that Nixon had been using, the disagreement is not in the goal but the means. And Kennedy used the phrasing I just said in there is not the exact phrasing, but there's a specific phrase that Nixon kept using, which is "we disagree not," and I can't remember the exact thing, but the point is that JFK then uses that phrase that Nixon's been hammering on and says, well, let's actually look at the differences, and just paints a brutal picture. It actually super reminds me. I wonder if there was any. I wonder if they took any inspiration from the 1960 debate. It super reminds me of V's speech in V for Vendetta, where he says, "If you feel how I feel, if you see what I see, then join with me on November 5th, 1 year from today." Something like that. It is a very good appeal to make because most of the time people are gonna be moderately happy with the situation, but people love to complain, people love to be negative. There's probably no point in American history where you couldn't make some statement like this. If you think everything's fine, if you think everything's, roses and peaches, then go vote for my opponent. There's almost no place in the world you could say that at any point in history where people would be like, everything is rosy and peachy. Okay, I'll go vote for your opponent. That's almost always gonna get people going like, yeah, man, the system is broken, man. Like, we gotta change, we gotta move forward. So it's a very effective kind of rhetoric and tone for JFK to utilize here.
Well, especially as a follow-up to a lot of the problems that he's been like pointing out earlier, right?
Yep.
Where like, I mean, I was earlier kind of accusing him of being fear-mongering or a little negative or whatever, but I think like that's a good setup for what he's doing now, right? Because I mean, earlier on he was talking about, it's like, well, we're not giving people enough medical care, and we've got all these like racial disparities in how well we're taking care of people, and teachers aren't getting paid enough, and the big bad scary Soviets are coming for us, and all that, and but then like, here he is, going for the follow through on all of that stuff, right? It's like,
Yep.
well, sure, if you just want to like pretend that none of that stuff is real and you think everything's fine, then go ahead, like.
Yeah, it is an excellent job of setting up a central theme, consistently hitting on it, and then throughout the debate, and then making sure you hit it in the conclusion as well, where it's like, yeah, he keeps it's like I buy it. Right, when I'm listening to this, I think a lot of average people listening to this are like, yeah, he's making a lot of sense here. Like, there's a coherent vision. And then when he pairs that, particular statements about, if you think everything's fine, with then this statement he goes into talking about the tide going out versus the tide coming in. And the idea that, we might not realize it now, but historians in 20 years might realize that, the beginning of the 1960s, this was a critical time. And that the stakes are so high. It all ties together perfectly. His opening statement, it's a question of, will the world be free or will the world be in slavery? In 10, 20 years, we might realize that this was our chance to stop the world from being in slavery. It's all part of a cohesive, coherent vision that just fits together like a perfect puzzle. And it is consistently hit upon. It is masterfully created. It's masterfully executed, and the result is, I think, a very strong performance for JFK here,
Yeah.
especially when he avoids getting dragged down to the line by line.
Yeah, and like, I think it's a little bit unfair to Nixon, because it's not like Nixon was sitting there saying everything is fine and we don't need to improve on anything. I mean, Nixon more or less tried to take the same line. He was like, "Well, we're doing well, but we still need to improve on things, right?" But because Nixon's message was a little bit more muddled, and because he was just getting caught up in all these technical details and didn't have as clear of like a through line for the audience to follow, I think Kennedy can get away with that same message made much more effectively.
Yep. It is a testament to how you need to be. You can't just say a thing. It really matters how you say it and the context in which you say it. I can imagine a lot of people debating in the 1960s, like a group of young friends, and a bunch of people are like, "Oh, I thought JFK did great in that debate," and someone who likes Nixon's like, "Well, why?" It's like, "Oh, well, he's talking about how we need to do more," and the Nixon person's like, "But he said that, but he said that," and everyone's just like, "Yeah, but like it's just not the same, you know? It's just not the same." It's kind of how certain politicians, I think you saw in the 2020 Democratic primary, a lot of politicians try to sort of adopt a lot of the veneer of Bernie Sanders after all the success he saw in 2016. And for a lot of them, it just didn't hit the same because it was like a thing that was sort of plastered on. Having a coherent message that you're dedicated to, that is part of a coherent world vision like Bernie Sanders is, and obviously Bernie Sanders also having said this for a long, long time, and not sort of flip-flopping it arguably like some people did just because they saw how popular it was for Bernie, that goes a long way in cementing your identity, your brand identity as a politician.
Well, and it creates the impression that those other people are just following his lead
Yeah,
also,
that too.
which
Yep.
is not a good look when you're running to be literally the leader.
Yep. Yeah, I think I guess I'm gonna play here.
Gentlemen, this hour has gone by all too quickly. Thank you very much for permitting us to present the next President of the United States on this unique program. I've been asked by the candidates to thank the American networks and the affiliated stations for providing time and facilities for this joint appearance. Other debates in this series will be announced later and will be on different subjects. This is Howard K. Smith. Good night from Chicago.
Well, you got it. You got anything else you want to add?
How are there only 46 videos in every presidential debate since 1960? There have been more than like.
Because there's like
Have there really only
there's
been
3 or 4 per election cycle, right?
Yeah, well, I guess, but like even then, that would only be like 10 presidents. Actually, yeah, maybe, huh? I guess that actually does just about line up, especially because some of them are gonna be off. Yeah, never mind then. Okay, my bad.
Yeah. So I thought Nixon did fine in terms of just like this. As far as I can tell, on the substantive facts of what he said, like we're not here fact checking him or whatever, right? He appeared to be like describing a case for the policies that he wanted to make, but he just like was much less effective at explaining it, and he didn't like come across with as clear of a theme or anything or a personality or any. He didn't give people reason to care about what he was saying the way that Kennedy did.
This is a great case study in how important charisma can be, and how two very messages, where if you really boil them down to like the most like logical, like to their core logic, like the statements that are being made, they're actually very similar.
Yeah.
But it's a world of difference when it comes to how those ideas are communicated and perceived, and why it's so important. Most people know that a big important thing for a job is negotiating your salary, even though that has absolutely nothing to do with how good of a worker you are, right? The idea that I could have two software engineers, one is like 10 times better than the other, but the one that's worse is like a great negotiator, and it still is of a competent skill level. It's the same thing with debate and rhetoric. You have to be able to the message, how you get the message to people matters just as much as the message itself. And this is a great case study in how you could come out of the other side of the debate feeling hugely different about JFK and Nixon, even though at a lot of points, as both of them agreed, they agreed on a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm just, I don't know if I have anything more to add. Do you want to shout yourself out before we're done?
Yeah, what's up, guys? My name is Flowtrace. You can check me out at twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace_. Thank you guys for checking me out. You can catch us here every Wednesday, and I will see you guys next time.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me. It's been a good time. I'm gonna go raid Stardust.
Copy that.